war in Ukraine could actually end. It's not exaggeration, it's not some optimistic fantasy. And if it's going to happen, then it could end up happening much sooner than anybody anticipated. A few days after what appeared to be an inconclusive summit in Alaska, Russia and Ukraine have both started to show that they're willing to make major compromises, the sort of compromises that both Putin and Zelensky need in order to agree to end the war. After years of diplomatic paralysis and without the fanfare or bravado that would suggest this is all smoke and mirrors, we seem to finally have a breakthrough in Eastern Europe, and one that could affect a ceasefire practically out of nowhere. Now, if that happens, then the ceasefire won't be an easy one for Ukraine to accept by any stretch. But the terms that are within reach for Ukraine today are a hell of a lot better than the terms that Vladimir Putin's Russia has offered before. Right now, we need to prepare for a breakthrough in the Ukraine war, to understand what's changed on both sides, explore what might be possible in a negotiation, and get our first look at what post-war Ukraine might actually be. Just before we get into the video today, it's brought to you by Outskill. Who are Outskill? Well, they are the largest AI education company on the planet, which is, AI is becoming very important. Recently, Microsoft said that they could eliminate 36% of their workforce through AI automation, which is kind of scary because you think if you work at Microsoft, you've got to be really skilled. Amazon, JP Morgan, Ford are all cutting jobs, but why not change things? Instead of being replaced by AI, why not be someone who's leading the charge? And that's why I have partnered with Outskill to give you guys free access to their 2-day AI Mastermind this weekend. Normally costs $895, but for you guys, my viewers, 1,000 free seats for the next 72 hours. 4 million people globally have already attended, and they're now using AI to earn more money, get those promotions, all of that good stuff. You'll master prompt engineering, learn 10 powerful AI tools like Make.com and Claude, build AI agents, automate your work, and create apps with AI, or even running your own business. This is for you, so mark your calendars. It's this Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. both days. Sign up now. You'll get $5,000 worth of bonuses, including a 3,000 plus prompt Bible. There is a link in the description below, as well as in the pinned comment. Grab your free seat before it expires and join their WhatsApp community for updates. Don't get left behind by AI. Master it this very weekend. And now today's episode. Rapid developments. Okay, let's break the fourth wall, because here at WarFronts, our team was on call over the weekend in the event that a major breakthrough or a catastrophic failure came out of the Alaska summit between Trump and Putin. Depending on what happens, we are ready to turn around an episode for Saturday evening to explain either the triumph or the tragedy of whatever had gone down on the edge of the Arctic Circle. But in the hours after the summit ended, we and the entire global press were left with that dreary third option that every content creator dreads. No real news in either direction. We were disappointed, but at least we had our weekend. With vague claims of progress, but zero details, zero outlines, and zero questions from the press, Trump and Putin left the summit and went their separate ways. At that moment, it luckily didn't seem as if the war's end was any further away than it had been before, but the prospect of a peace deal didn't seem as if it had improved either. But over the weekend, a slow, steady drip of revelations began to flow outward from Alaska, with the first changes coming from Trump himself. According to sources within Washington, Trump's conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday night centered on one key change in Russia's position. Whereas Putin had been stating consistently before the summit began that he and Russia would insist on complete control of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts or regions that Russia claims to have annexed, his ambitions in that regard appeared to be more limited in private conversation. During the summit, Putin had expressed that if Kyiv ceded territorial control of Donetsk Oblast, already mostly under the control of Russian forces, as well as accepting Russian control over Luhansk Oblast, which Russian forces already control, then Russia would consent to a freeze of the front lines across the rest of Ukraine. For Russia, as limited as it might sound, that is a fairly major concession, and one that demonstrated a potential willingness to accept a far more neutral set of ceasefire terms than the terms it had previously advocated. Of course, a peace in Ukraine will take compromise from both sides, and according to the weekend's news, Zelensky had rejected that offer when Trump first explained it. But in a surprising turn of events from Kyiv, it took less than 48 hours for Zelensky to change his tune. Now, much like Putin has been demanding full control of 4 of Ukraine's oblasts before the summit, not just Donetsk and Luhansk, but Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, Zelensky has kept a similarly hardline position in the opposite direction. According to Zelensky, Ukraine intends to seek a full return of all territory occupied by Russia, including all 4 oblasts in question and the Isthmus of Crimea, annexed and occupied by Russia back in 2014. In fact, much to Donald Trump's chagrin, Zelensky has been arguing that because the Ukrainian constitution does not grant him the right to give away the nation's territory, any idea of a land swap is fundamentally impossible. But when Zelensky gave a press conference this Sunday in the city of Brussels, ahead of his meeting with Trump in Washington yesterday, he changed his tune on the question for the very first time. Said Zelensky of the prospect of a land swap, quoting here, "We need real negotiations, which means we can start where the front line is now." Zelensky expressed that his position came with the support of allied leaders in Europe. Also on Sunday, Trump's primary negotiating envoy, Steve Witkoff, told CNN that Putin had made another major concession at the Alaska meeting. According to Witkoff, Putin had agreed that the United States and the nations of Europe could offer Ukraine a security guarantee, basically pledging that the US and Europe would defend Ukraine's sovereignty against any further invasion by Russia. Now, on its face, that might sound like a claim that Trump himself contradicted the following day when, on Monday, Trump told Ukraine over social media to accept that for the foreseeable future, Ukraine had no hope of joining NATO. But what Witkoff is describing and what Vladimir Putin's supposedly agreed to isn't that Ukraine would join NATO, it's that Ukraine would get a major benefit that is generally tied to NATO membership. A collective security agreement with the United States and Europe that Ukraine can use as a guarantor of its sovereignty in the years to come. While that offer is a surprise coming from Putin, it's important because it inherently offers Putin a win of his own, namely the ability to go back to Russia and claim victory because it's kept Ukraine out of NATO. Not only that, but the offer would likely allow European troops to deploy to Ukraine as part of a coalition of the willing, a presence on Russia's border that Putin has seemed to suggest that he could live with. Quoting Witkoff, "We agreed to robust security guarantees that I would describe as game-changing." On Monday, the 18th of August, Zelensky and leaders from NATO and several European nations joined Donald Trump at the White House for their own summit, and again, all parties indicated that a push toward peace was a real possibility. Despite a wave of Russian attacks against Ukrainian population centers that day, Ukraine and its European allies agreed to engage Russia in direct negotiations as soon as possible. Details from the meeting behind closed doors haven't leaked out as of the time of writing, but a chorus of public statements from Zelensky and his European partners all indicated, at least for the global press, that things were headed in the right direction. As NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte told the press, quote, "If we play this well, we could end this, and we have to end it." Just before we continue today, real quick plug, make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter for the absolute most breakingest of breaking news that we can't get videos out quickly enough on. It goes out twice per week, and it's completely free. Did I mention that? So subscribe below, why not? Potential for compromise. Now, at this point in today's episode, we got to be real clear. Right now, all we're observing are a series of changes in rhetoric, some coming from the involved parties themselves and some described secondhand by other international actors. Ukraine and Russia are each publicly sticking to many of their prior hardline positions, even while seeming to contradict those positions in real time. But in a negotiation to end a years-long war, hardline positions that reiterate each side's unwillingness to compromise, quite frankly, those are cheap and easy statements to make, with no real consequences other than a continuation of the status quo. Statements of potential compromise, however, are not nearly so easy to abandon, and until the last several days, both sides have been very disciplined about avoiding anything that might even hint at a willingness to back off some of their claims. For Russia and Ukraine, both to be changing that now is an important shift on its own, even before it's followed by action. Now, putting aside the rhetoric from both sides, the reality of the situation in Ukraine is that in any peace deal, Ukraine would probably have to make some major sacrifices. Russia sits on roughly a fifth of Ukraine's territory, and for Russia to agree to give that territory back without facing any overwhelming threat that would lead Putin to raise the white flag has always been an unrealistic outcome. So too would a peace deal probably have required Putin to relinquish at least some of his territorial claims in Ukraine. Just like Russia, Ukraine's position isn't nearly so terrible right now that the nation would be forced into agreeing to give back a huge chunk of land. But for both Putin and Zelensky to admit that they're willing to accept less than ideal territorial conditions at basically the same time, that's a massive change. More importantly, the terms they each endorsed would suggest that there's room to achieve a genuine compromise. If we take him at his word, Zelensky would go into a series of peace negotiations, starting with the boundaries of the current front line, meaning, by default, the condition he and Ukraine would consent to would be for the front lines to freeze. If we take Putin's word as what's been reported by sources in Washington, then his default condition is also a frozen front line, except for Donetsk Oblast, which Russia would control fully. Russia would also control Luhansk Oblast fully, but that's already the case. And even though Zelensky has provisionally rejected Russia's proposal, that stance seems already to be changing, and if Russia is willing to bargain for control over Donetsk Oblast, then it could make a series of meaningful offers to Ukraine in return. Russia controls a chunk of border territory near the city of Sumy, where Ukrainian leaders reported yesterday that Russian forces have been defeated and deterred from their attempt to actually take the city itself. Russia also holds a narrow pocket of land in Kharkiv Oblast, and speaking of Kharkiv, Russia also controls the zone along the regional border with Luhansk. If Russia were willing to give each of those three zones back to Ukraine, it may allow Ukraine to accept Russian control over Donetsk in its entirety, especially when that territory swap is paired with non-territorial concessions that Russia might be willing to make. And speaking of non-territorial concessions, the question of Ukraine's NATO membership is one that we've got to break apart into two components. Ukraine's desire to have a NATO-style security guarantee from the West versus Ukraine's desire to be a formal, proper part of the organization known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. If Ukraine wants the latter, if it wants to explicitly be a part of NATO, then Putin's apparent offer to accept a NATO-style security guarantee would be a non-starter. But if ultimately, the thing that Ukraine needs most is a security guarantee, then a lack of formal NATO membership might not mean very much in practice. If Putin's ultimate objective is to save face and essentially claim victory on a technicality, then there is no reason why Ukraine wouldn't be able to hammer out an extensive deal with NATO member nations, building on the arms agreements, the interoperability principles, and the diplomatic relationships that Ukraine already has with those nations. In fact, once those deals were in place, it might not even cost Ukraine very much to formally suspend or withdraw its bid for NATO membership. This would allow Russian state media to crow about Ukraine's capitulation while never mentioning that Ukraine's actually got most of what it wanted. If, at the end of the day, Putin would stand by as Ukraine seals a deal with the West that's separate from NATO but grants all the same protections as NATO membership would, then certainly that's a tedious request for Ukraine to have to accommodate. But 3.5 years of war have also been quite tedious, and for Ukraine, some headaches of paperwork might be a price worth paying. There are, of course, still some outstanding issues that don't yet seem as if they've been accounted for. On Sunday, ahead of the talks in Washington, French President Emmanuel Macron expressed Ukraine's need for a strong army of its own in a post-war Europe in reference to the likelihood of Russia attempting to impose constraints on Ukraine's future military. While Putin's apparent openness to European deployments in Ukraine would suggest that Ukraine's rearmament might be an area of compromise, it could also be an attempt by Putin to force Ukraine to downsize its military and accept European protection instead, possibly in hopes that Russia could then divide Kiev from its European allies in the future. And most important of all, judging by the recent rhetoric from Ukraine, is Kiev's insistence that Russia agree to a temporary ceasefire before peace negotiations begin. That is a stance that Russia has refused to agree to, and a couple of days ago, it was a stance that Trump openly dismissed. As of Monday's negotiations, this ceasefire before negotiations position remains a divisive issue, with Ukraine and its European partners holding firm to the idea that a ceasefire should come into effect before any further peace negotiations, with Trump again dismissing a ceasefire as an unnecessary prerequisite for talks to end the war. But with all nations now in agreement that it's time for a three-way meeting that would bring Putin and Zelensky face-to-face, the question of a ceasefire may be put aside in favor of leveraging the opportunity for a peace summit before it can vanish again in the near future. Just as important, the situation on the Ukrainian battlefield today isn't the same as it was when this summit was about to begin. Last week, Russia was making headlines after its forces pushed past the front lines near the embattled town of Pokrovsk in what seemed to be a major change of battlefield momentum. Now, however, elite Ukrainian units appear to have taken charge and neutralized that Russian threat, while in the north, Ukraine claims that the Russian advance near Sumy has been blunted as well. Under those conditions, with less battlefield momentum and a looming Ukrainian winter, Russia may be more open to the idea of a temporary pause, or in practice, the Ukrainian military might not feel as strongly about insisting that a pause takes effect. A temporary ceasefire would save many lives on both sides and should absolutely be a consideration, but if it doesn't happen, then the implications for Ukraine aren't so dire anymore. Of course, we should be very clear that there's a strong possibility that Putin is just baiting the US and Ukraine, leading on its Western adversaries in order to buy time or work through some larger plan that Putin believes will grant him an advantage. Or if they do begin, peace talks could just stall and collapse, or any number of Russia's apparent concessions could turn out to be part of a convoluted plan to benefit Russia in the long run. That would mirror Russia's prior conduct in advance of its full-scale Ukraine invasion in 2022. Certainly, if this apparent movement toward peace can continue, then we'll be back here to discuss these potential pitfalls, and if you're interested in a longer episode in the future depicting all the ways that Putin could use these concessions to stab Ukraine in the back, then let us know in the comments. But even still, the movement of the last couple of days represents a shift unlike what we've seen previously in this conflict, with both sides finally admitting a willingness to make concessions, and with the outline of each side's potential concessions actually showing an encouraging amount of overlap. No matter what happens next, that's a major shift for Ukraine and Russia alike. So how could Ukraine look if in a few months' time it turns out that these early signs of compromise resulted in genuine peace? Well, quite likely, Ukraine would have to concede both Donetsk and Luhansk, giving up hard-fought territory near Pokrovsk that Ukraine has defended for over a year. Ukraine would be forced to rework its eastern lines of defense, adjusting to accommodate the loss of important logistical nodes and defensive constructions. In return, Russian occupations in Sumy and Kharkiv could go away, perhaps with a thin no-man's land dividing Kharkiv from Donetsk and Luhansk, or perhaps with Ukraine-controlled and Russia-controlled lands meeting directly. In Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, the front lines would freeze or possibly adjust slightly in some places so that Ukrainian and Russian territory can sit on opposite sides of the Dnieper River. Moving forward, international maps might refer to Russia's new holdings as occupied Ukrainian territory or as part of the Russian Federation, with the Crimean Isthmus likely to follow suit. Ukraine could accept forward deployments of thousands of European troops backed up by air support and naval reinforcement on the Black Sea, while hammering out a NATO-esque deal to ensure that future Russian aggression is met with a unified response. Perhaps that version of an Eastern Europe is a version that could remain at peace, but the only answer to that question will come with time. Thank you for watching.